So thank you for the opportunity to present to the small business group at the North Carolina DEQ. We're going to start out by talking about what EPA has done over the past few years and is continuing to do this year with regard to the chlorinated solvents under the Toxic Substances Control Act. There are 4 of these chlorinated solvents, and all 4 are listed on this slide. The first one to be proposed was methylene chloride. Well, the risk evaluations for all these were completed in 1990. I'm sorry, in 2020, and the proposed rules were proposed for all of them last year. The first being methylene chloride, and this year, last month, May 8th, a final rule for methylene chloride was published in the Federal Register. Perchloroethylene followed along as a proposed rule in June of last year, and we see that EPA has sent for clearance a final rule on perchloroethylene to OMB, which means that when that is cleared in 6 or 8 weeks, it too will be published in the Federal Register. So there will then be 2 of these rules out in final. Carbon tetrachloride was proposed in July of last year. And finally, trichloroethylene was proposed in Halloween of last year. And it's truly a kind of a scary hobgoblin of a rule. As I mentioned, all these were based on risk evaluations that EPA completed in 2020 and subsequently put out revised risk determinations for each of them in 2022. You can go to the next slide, please. In every case, EPA proposed to ban most industrial, commercial, and consumer uses, what EPA calls conditions of use. That's some 50 or 60 for each solvent. These proposed bans accounted for from 1/3 to almost all the total annual production volume, depending on the solvent. Carbon tetrachloride is a special case. There were not very many conditions of use for carbon tetrachloride because it was the production and import of carbon tetrachloride was eliminated or phased out in around 2004 under the Montreal Protocol because it's an ozone depleting substance. However, that phase out does not apply to feedstock use. So there continues to be a substantial amount of carbon tetrachloride imported and produced here for use as a feedstock, mainly in the production of HFOs, which are the next generation refrigerant alternatives. For a number of conditions of use, EPA proposed implementation of what it calls Workplace Chemical Protection Plans, or WCPPs, as an alternative to a ban. I listed here some of these uses which can continue subject to a WCPP. They include manufacturing or import for uses that are still allowed, uses that are not banned, feedstock for the manufacture of HFCs and HFOs, use as a processing aid for EV battery manufacturing, use as a laboratory chemical, paint and coating removal from safety critical components of aircraft, and several safety critical uses identified by NASA, DOD, FAA, and Homeland Security. And finally, disposal is allowed to continue. We can go to the next slide. Some of the allowed uses are time limited, in effect, phase downs. We'll get into some of those a little later, particularly with regard to perc and dry cleaning. Under the WCPP, there is an 8-hour time-weighted average called existing chemical exposure limit, or ECHL. For methylene chloride, that limit is 2 parts per million. For the others, it's much, much lower, 140 parts per billion for perchloroethylene, 30 parts per billion for carbon tet, and 1 or 4 parts per trillion for TCE. In the case of methylene chloride, EPA also has adopted a short-term exposure limit, which is a 15-minute TWA of 16 parts per million. The WCPPs that companies have to have in place must also include requirements for regulated areas, exposure monitoring, methods of compliance, respiratory and dermal protection, and training. Next slide, please. The ECHLs, whether proposed or final, are based on the following endpoints: 2 parts per million for methylene chloride based on liver toxicity. This is a very curious one because that's based on rat studies that show vacuolation, but there was no liver toxicity found in medical surveillance of hundreds of workers, which are documented in epidemiological reviews that are in the record of the rulemaking. For PERC, the 140 part per billion limit is based on neurotoxicity as well as cancer risk. For carbon tet, the 30 parts per billion is based on cancer risk. And then finally, for TCE, the 1 part per trillion limit is based on fetal cardiac anomalies in rodents, a study that's never been capable of being reproduced, or if it could be 4 parts per trillion based on immunotoxicity in rodents. That's as proposed. We haven't seen the final rule yet. Commenters, of which my association HSI was one, noted that EPA did not use the best available science or the weight of the scientific evidence as required by TSCA when it did the risk evaluations. And when you compare these limits to the OSHA PELs, you see dramatic differences. For methylene chloride, the OSHA limit is 25 parts per million as a TWA, 8-hour TWA, and 125 parts per million as a STEL. For PERC, the OSHA limit is 100 parts per million. For carbon tet, it's 10 parts per million. And for TCE, it is 100 parts per million. Next slide. This handy slide, I know it's busy, but maybe you can see it, gives a comparison of the proposed ECHLs to current OSHA PELs as well as foreign country workplace limits. And you see, if you read across, you'll see that the foreign country PELs and the OSHA PEL generally are same, certainly in the same range. Whereas when you look over at the EPA ECHL, you see it's much lower. In the case of methylene chloride, it's 12.5 times lower than the OSHA limit. In the case of perchloroethylene, it's 714 times lower. Carbon tet, it's 333 times lower. And finally, for poor TCE, it's 90,909 times lower if EPA adopts the 1 part per trillion, or it's 25,000 times lower if EPA adopts 4 parts per trillion. Next slide. So how did it happen? This, it seems to me, is a fairly disastrous outcome. Certainly it was for the chlorinated solvents that I represent. In 2016, the Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act was signed into law, and it made substantial changes to TSCA. The most important being that it requires EPA to consider potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations, including workers, in evaluating chemical substances. By including the word workers, the Lautenberg Act upended 50 years of workplace regulation of toxic substance, which had always been the province of OSHA. And the PELs under the Occupational Safety and Health Act must reduce significant risk, but they also must be economically and technically feasible, all in accordance with the decision of the Supreme Court in 1980 called the benzene decision. Under TSCA, as revised in 2016, on the other hand, where EPA finds unreasonable risk, it must regulate to the extent necessary so that the chemical substance no longer presents such risk. And EPA's position is that EPA must apply TSCA Section 6 risk management requirements to the extent necessary so that the unreasonable risk is no longer presented. No consideration of feasibility, just get rid of anything that EPA labels as an unreasonable risk. The problem with that is that EPA's methodology for determining risk has really not changed in 45 years. It's very unclear to me why the American Chemistry Council supported the Lautenberg Act with this language, but it did, and that is now the law. Next slide, please. So back to the nuts and bolts, the WCPPs. Obviously, many firms in compliance with the OSHA limits will not be able to meet the EPA ECHL. EPA assumed, however, that a number of workplace conditions of use would not be able to achieve the ECHL. Assumed that, I should say, didn't show it, and proposed that for the workplaces that it assumed could not achieve those limits, that it would ban use of the solvents in those workplaces, even if they were able to show that they could comply with the much lower limits. So TSCA provides for EPA to restrict uses that present an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment, and to regulate only to the extent necessary so that the chemical no longer presents such risk. We believe that if a use can comply with an ECHL, then EPA would seem to lack authority to ban it. Indeed, interpreting similar language in the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Supreme Court held in benzene that before promulgating any standard, the Secretary must make a finding that the workplaces in question are not safe. But safe is not the equivalent of risk-free. There are many activities we engage in every day, such as driving a car or even breathing city air, that entail some risk of accident or material health impairment. Nevertheless, few people would consider these activities unsafe. Similarly, a workplace can hardly be considered unsafe unless it threatens the workers with a significant risk of harm. Next slide, please. TSCA Section 6C provides that if a regulation would operate in a manner that substantially prevents a specific condition of use of a chemical, EPA must consider whether technically and economically feasible alternatives that benefit health or the environment compared to the use so proposed to be prohibited will be reasonably available as a substitute. Whereas in these proposed rules, most uses would be banned, the alternatives assessment is obviously critical. Yet EPA's economic analyses completely fail to consider the impact on American manufacturing competitiveness of banning the uses that it proposes to ban or did ban in the case of methylene chloride. I just put in bullets here a few examples. For methylene chloride used in furniture refinishing, EPA found that alternatives to products containing methylene chloride may not be economically viable and may cause damage to the substrate. The impact of a prohibition of methylene chloride for furniture refinishing could result in the closure of some 5,000 firms. That's what EPA has now adopted. No more antique refinishing in the United States.
Need something?
I'm sorry.
Whoops.
Next bullet. PERC and TCE are used to formulate non-flammable brake cleaners. There are some 250,000 auto repair shops in this country, almost all of them small businesses. And there are many sources of flame and spark, obviously in a garage or a brake shop. yet viable non-flammable alternatives were not identified by EPA. Next slide. Another important category where EPA identified no alternatives to the solvents is use as a processing aid, such as the manufacture of battery separators or for heat transfer. Alternatives may react to form impurities, have too high a boiling point, or be flammable. Only these solvents are known to yield suitable products. And I note in parentheses there, in response to comments, the final methylene chloride rule did broaden the processing aid applications allowed to continue with the WCPP. That's important to note this, though, that what EPA is doing essentially is if your industry or your company has a use such as battery separator manufacturing, you bring it to EPA's attention as part of the rulemaking process, and it's considered politically sensitive, then EPA will allow it. But for all the hundreds of uses and thousands of users that don't fall into that category, you're just out of luck. So this approach, I think, underscores the shortcoming. It has a shortcoming, which EPA has failed to consider the properties of these chemicals that make them uniquely suited to the hundreds or thousands of uses that they have acquired over the past decades. Finally, on this subject, the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, or SBEAP, requires EPA to pay particular attention to whether small firms can comply with its regulations. Where other options were available to regulate to the extent necessary so that the chemical no longer presents such risk, however, EPA proposed to allow only regulated entities that may have fewer challenges implementing requirements to meet an ECL because work activities may occur in sophisticated facilities or take place in a closed system. Next slide. What that means, in effect, is that EPA has turned SBEAP on its head. So it's made it it's discriminating against small businesses in the way it adopts and enforces its regulations under TSCA. I wanted to give a little attention to perchloroethylene, which, as you may know, is the most widely used dry cleaning solvent. The proposed ECL for PERC is a 99.86% reduction from the PEL. And what EPA has proposed is a 10-year phase out for PERC use in dry cleaning, which would proceed in stages as shown here. First, there's a prohibition on the use of PERC in any dry cleaning machine acquired 6 months or more after adoption of the final rule. Second, there's a prohibition on the use of PERC in third-generation machines 3 years after adoption of the final rule. Next, there's a prohibition on the use of PERC in all dry cleaning and spot cleaning, including in fourth and fifth generation machines 10 years after adoption of the final rule. And then finally, there's a prohibition on manufacturing and selling PERC for use as a dry cleaning solvent 10 years after adoption of the final rule. EPA justified this phase out on the basis that few PERC machines are sold in the United States and dry cleaning machines are retired 15 to 25 years after the manufacture date. The EPA estimates that 6,000 dry cleaners still use PERC and that about 60 machines are expected still to be in use at the end of the 10-year phase out period. I can guarantee you that that is off by 100-fold, at least, maybe 1,000-fold, but at least 100-fold. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the TCE alternatives assessment. Here, you saw that the ECL is either 1 or 4 parts per trillion. EPA seems to have recognized that it's not feasible to achieve that limit. So it proposed not that the owner or operator of a facility comply with the ECL, but that it ensure to the extent possible that no person is exposed in excess of the ECHL. Ensure to the extent possible, whatever that means. In addition to being infeasible, neither of those numbers, 1 or 4, can be reliably measured in the workplace. Both values are below the practical limit of detection, which EPA recognizes as 36 parts per billion. Indeed, 1 part per trillion is close to the background concentrations of TCE in urban air. So, given EPA's conclusion that most users will never be able to achieve the ECHL, clearly great effort would be required for EPA to meet the mandate in TSCA Section 6 that if its regulation operates in a manner that prevents a use, EPA must consider whether technically and economically feasible alternatives compared to that benefit health or the environment compared to the use proposed to be prohibited will be reasonably available as a substitute. Remarkably, EPA's alternatives analysis for TCE acknowledged that EPA did not find it practicable to consider alternative processes that may be reasonably available as a substitute for processes involving TCE when the proposed prohibitions or restrictions would take effect. So EPA did not comply with that provision of TSCA and acknowledges that it did not comply with it. Next slide, please. TSCA Section 9 requires EPA to consult and coordinate with other federal agencies to achieve maximum enforcement while imposing the least burdens of duplicative requirements. EPA says it coordinated with OSHA on the proposed rules and states that gaps exist between OSHA's authority to set workplace standards and EPA's obligations under TSCA Section 6. But worker health and safety continues to fall primarily under the jurisdiction of OSHA, and its comprehensive regulatory framework developed over the last 50 years provides protections with respect to the same adverse effects and exposure pathways targeted by these proposed rules. Taking steps that may lead to the removal of products from the marketplace where workplaces comply with these existing requirements may not be consistent with TSCA either as enacted or as revised by the Lautenberg Act. And legislative history, we submit, supports the position that TSCA was intended to fill gaps in regulation, not to supplant the existing regulatory frameworks. Next slide. So as I guess I kind of made the point earlier, these proposals clearly discriminate against small businesses where other long-term options are available, including continuing to use a solvent subject to a WCPP. It is inconsistent with TSCA to conclude that it does not believe that long-term implementation of a WCPP would be a feasible means of addressing unreasonable risk indefinitely. Thus, prohibition of the use for affected COUs is ultimately necessary to address the risk so that it is no longer unreasonable. EPA's uncertainty as to whether most users can comply with its ECHLs is not, in my view, a sufficient reason to eliminate any compliance option for such users, most of which are small businesses. The only justification for such a ban is that it would present an unreasonable risk that EPA does not believe is feasibly addressed through WCPPs, though these same WCPPs are in place for long-term phase-out and exemption periods. It's not logical. Finally, the proposed definition of retailer would make it impossible for most small businesses to obtain product, as sales would be restricted only to commercial suppliers. Next slide. So there is going to be litigation. In fact, I'm pleased to announce that we brought the first lawsuit challenging the methylene chloride rule, and it has been the judicial panel on these, which holds a lottery. There was also a suit filed by the Sierra Club in San Francisco, the Ninth Circuit, but our petition was in the Fifth Circuit was chosen in the lottery. So the challenge to the methylene chloride rule is going to go forward in the Fifth Circuit, which is generally regarded as more favorable to industry challenges, certainly than the Ninth Circuit in California. Among the issues that will be raised in this, and I believe each of these rules will probably be challenged, is EPA's interpretation of unreasonable risk, which it has chosen not to define, EPA's failure to use best available science, failure to rely on weight of the scientific evidence. We believe that the unreasonable risk determinations do not have substantial evidence supporting them as required by TSCA. Inadequate consideration of alternatives. The point that I made earlier, having determined that an ECHL eliminates unreasonable risk, we believe any workplace in compliance with an ECHL should not be subject to a use ban, and uses meeting the ECHL should be allowed to continue without a time limit. Another point, more of a legal point, is that EPA deviated from the procedural framework for risk evaluations that it adopted in 2017. Instead, under the Biden administration, EPA adopted a new approach where it said it will determine whether there's unreasonable risk for each chemical as a whole chemical, instead of making the determination for each condition of use. And it used high-end exposure estimates, assuming that firms would not be in compliance with OSHA limits, even though, again, such compliance is part of the circumstances of use as defined by TSCA. And finally, we think litigation will focus on EPA's failure to comply with SBEAP. Next slide. So I want to leave you with this as a cautionary note in case you think that the concerns I pointed out are limited to the chlorinated solvents. Those are the first four grouped at the top of this slide. I've already covered those. The second 20 priority list includes several chemicals, formaldehyde, which Clint will be speaking to, and ethylene dichloride. For formaldehyde, for example, the proposed ECHL is 68 times lower than the OSHA PEL, and the OSHA PEL being comparable to foreign country PELs, it's also out of line with the rest of the world. For ethylene dichloride, which is a feedstock for vinyl chloride, you can see it's 6,000. The ECHL is 6,000 times lower than the OSHA limit. And you can go down the list. In the 15 priority chemicals, the same thing is true for vinyl chloride, where EPA's ECHL is 15 times lower than the OSHA limit. And, 1,3-butadiene and chloroprene are the others shown here. As long as there is a IRIS risk assessment, one can take that and determine what the ECHL is going to be quite simply. So, the writing is on the wall. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, if adopted as proposed, these rules will cripple U.S. manufacturing competitiveness by offshoring production of hundreds of important products to other countries. No other country in the world has in place or under consideration workplace limits approaching the proposed ECHLs, which are unachievable and not even measurable in many cases for many manufacturing uses. Thank you.
And Mark, if you don't mind, maybe it's a good chance for us to pause and see if Caffey, if you're okay, if anybody has any questions for you, and then I'll figure out how to share my slides if that works.
Yeah, that would be great. Any questions? I haven't really been looking at the chat, but now I am. I don't see anything posted. Caffey and Clint, you have drawn a lot of participation, so your topic is of intense interest, I would say. Or topics.
Happy to answer any questions.
Well, Caffey, this is Tony. I'll ask if you don't mind. It seems with methylene chloride, it's a bit too late. I mean, if it's already banned and you can't import it, and as of a month ago, how long's the
No,
litigation going to take? Oh, go ahead.
no. In each case, starting with methylene chloride, and this will be true in the other rules, these rules do not go into effect until there's a staggered effective compliance time. So some parts go into effect in a year, some in a year and a quarter, some in a year and a half. We're hoping that by the time the rule would come into effect, that we will have a decision from the court.
Thanks. That helps.
Great. Well, this is Clint, and if there are no other questions, I'll go ahead and maybe switch to a couple of follow-up items from some things that Caffey covered. Are you all able to see PowerPoint slide okay?
Yeah.
Great. Let's see. That still work okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Sorry for the trouble. I'm on a single screen out visiting family this week, but my name's Clint Woods. I'm with a company called Hexion, based out of Columbus, Ohio. As Mark mentioned, we make formaldehyde and other specialty chemicals. We're the leading producer of formaldehyde and formaldehyde-based resins, resins and adhesives and glues that go into things like the wood products, building and construction industry, but also in a wide variety of applications for transportation, energy, agriculture, a wide variety of other end-use sectors. We've been around for a number of years, had a lot of names. In the past, we used to be Borden Chemical. And I'm very pleased to be here. So, as I mentioned, my name's Clint, but I also am familiar with you all. I have worked with Tony and Mark and others in a few different hats in the past, including as the deputy in EPA's Air Office, as well as the executive director of APCA, the Association of Air Pollution Control Agencies. I think Caffey and I both are among the leading advocates for groups like yours, as well as the SBA Office of Advocacy. And unfortunately, I think there's some troubling signs at EPA under the TSCA program that we wanted to make sure to bring to your attention. So with Caffey covering a lot of what we've seen recently under TSCA, I thought it might be good to step back a little bit about how this is supposed to work. And I'll just say, I think you all are uniquely situated to help bridge some gaps that the EPA Chemicals Office is lacking as it relates to stakeholder outreach to states, to other federal agencies like SBA, to small businesses, to tribes and others that frankly are not happening in the current TSCA process. And I think there's a lot of relevance. I know you all were created under Section 507 of the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, but I think there's a lot of commonality. I think if you haven't already, you'll be hearing questions from your small entities about these risk management rules that are coming through the TSCA process. It intersects, I think, with a lot of priority Clean Air Act issues. So a similar path where EPA is relying heavily upon IRIS values that are extremely low to dictate ultimately scientific assessments and regulatory and reporting outcomes, have a lot to do with what we're seeing under Air Tox Screen, what used to be known as the National Air Toxics Assessment, the Air Emissions Reporting Requirements Rule, which I know you all are keenly aware of, and then overall how EPA approaches acceptable and unacceptable risk under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act that is near and dear to many of you and your clientele in your states. I also think the TSCA program is unfortunately a little bit of the tip of the spear for some EPA trends that are troubling, at least from my perspective. One around reduced procedural and scientific rigor of a lot of their programs, a lot more shifting to non-notice and comment rulemaking, and instead in the form of guidance or scientific assessment where there's not a commitment to responding public comment or engaging other agencies or states in the way that they would under a Clean Air Act rule. Secondly, I think a reduced engagement with stakeholders, as I mentioned, especially states, federal agencies, tribes, and small businesses. And finally, I'll just say the takeover of a lot of our environmental statutes by the IRIS program, a program that's never been authorized by Congress, that is dictating a lot of outcomes. I know any of you who've dealt with chloroprene or ethylene oxide in recent years have seen the way that those values can dictate regulatory enforcement litigation outside of the regulatory context. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about formaldehyde, which is a chemistry near and dear to my heart and our company's business, but also that I think is an interesting case study in that it's one of the most well-studied chemicals on Earth. It's obviously a hazardous air pollutant that's regulated under multiple other environmental statutes. It's got high background levels that come from natural sources as well as the human body. And it's also one where there's really not, as Caffey covered, not a lot of cost-effective alternatives that exist for the vast majority of uses. So here's a little bit, just an outline of what I was hoping to cover, just step back a little bit about how the existing chemical review process is supposed to work under the 2016 amendments of TSCA, talk a little bit about some of the other chemicals that are coming down the pike, and Caffey previewed a few of those. Maybe cover a little bit the intersection between Clean Air Act, TSCA, and IRIS programs. In the case of formaldehyde, FIFRA is also under review as a pesticidal use. And then finally kind of run through a little bit of the concerning trends that we've seen in EPA's draft risk evaluation of formaldehyde that could lead to perhaps even more economically impactful bans or unachievable workplace standards, and troubling sign of things to come. And then maybe turn a little bit to some things that you may be able to do in your capacity as small business ombudsman and small business environmental assistance programs.
Hey, Clint, we're not getting presentation mode. We're still seeing your first slide.
Okay, let me see if I can fix that. Sorry for the trouble.
I see second now.
Okay, I'll just do it in this format then instead of the presentation mode. Let me see if that works. Sorry for the trouble. And I'll also make sure to get these around. So here's just in general, and Caffey covered this in the case studies of solvents, but the 2016 amendments, one of the key changes was around how EPA reviews existing chemicals, and kind of a three-step process. So taken from an inventory of chemicals under TSCA, EPA is to really make one of two determinations in prioritizing those chemicals. Is it high priority or low priority? And then in turn, if it's a high priority chemical, like the solvents that Caffey mentioned, like formaldehyde, like a few other chemistries that I'll mention in just a minute, they then go into a risk evaluation stage in which really there's a lot done. It looks a lot like an IRIS assessment along with a number of different exposure assessments. But ultimately, the EPA determination that matters is whether or not that chemical, either in individual conditions of use or with recent practice, the whole chemical constitutes an unreasonable risk. And if that determination is made, then EPA proceeds to risk management, where a final risk management rule needs to be issued within 2 years. And really, I think the key, at least in the current administration's approach to TSCA, is that there's two options in risk management for any unreasonable risk. One is a ban, and that's the primary option in most of these proposed and final rules. And then secondly, if not a ban, you may have a potentially unachievable workplace standard as reflected in what Caffey referred to as the WCPP, or Worker Chemical Protection Program. And then some time-limited exemptions, primarily in areas where other federal agencies have weighed in, where there's national security, where there may be some obvious countervailing risks, but a very limited, less than 10 years of that exemption existing. So a really concerning trends of kind of ban first. So really, those risk evaluations are where a lot of the important decisions are made. Formaldehyde is the first one in which EPA has added another piece, which is their initial draft, what Caffey referred to it as an ECHL, the existing chemical exposure limit, has now been added into risk evaluation for formaldehyde, and that appears to be the trend that EPA will be following in the future. So a lot of that work happens in risk evaluation. We're extremely concerned because that process is not a rulemaking, not subject to judicial review, doesn't go through any interagency process. Frankly, there's no meaningful response to comment, little engagement with states or tribes or others. And so a lot of that is baked in. It's kind of like the worst aspects of the NAAQS process. And then really all the procedural stuff happens at the end, but all the key decisions have already been made. So here's just a sense of some of the upcoming rules. So the first 5 listed here are the 5 chemicals that are either been finalized or soon to be final in terms of risk management. So Caffey covered 4 of these 5. Wanted to give in that second bullet some examples, because I think in a lot of cases, folks have viewed TSCA as, if I don't make or sell or distribute this chemical, I'm not affected. But we're seeing with a lot of these initial 5, quite a few cross-cutting impacts, indirect effects on companies that don't produce or even directly use these chemicals that could impact them up or down the supply chain. Things like sheet gaskets that contain white asbestos, a wide variety of industrial commercial uses as laboratory chemicals, processing aids, in formulations, mixtures, and reaction products, in which case you may not even have it listed on a safety data sheet for one of your products, but that you may ultimately feel the impact of these bans or unachievable workplace standards. And then the last couple bullets there are the remainder of those first 10 priority chemicals where we'll likely see risk management in the next couple years. The first being NMP, and then several others that are awaiting risk management. Just one note here, there's some familiar hazardous air pollutants listed here, including, for example, one bromopropane. which EPA actually, the Air Office added to the HAP list. It's the only thing that's been added since the 1990 Clean Air Act amendment. So we're now up to 188 HAP. Part of the reason for the Air Office to do so was because, at least when I was there, the view of the Air Office was that the air toxics program provides a pretty comprehensive approach to managing and addressing unreasonable risk, and that we wanted to make sure that that those HAPs were well covered. Having said that, I think EPA is obviously not afraid of a little bit of duplication here. So there's some concerning intersections with Clean Air Act programs, but you'll see there additional Part 2 of asbestos, which includes legacy uses, 1,4-dioxane, several others. The next slide, here's the next 20 high priority chemicals where we'll be seeing risk evaluations over the next couple of years. You'll see at the bottom of that list formaldehyde and a number of others, phthalates that were manufacturer requested, a few others, some of which are in pretty minimal use like TCEP, and then really a slew of additional risk evaluations. So a lot of work upcoming for EPA's chemicals office in implementing this program. And then EPA has also gone through a process to go from a list of about 15 potential new priority existing chemicals down to 5. And this is a chart that was produced by the agency. The columns here you see match up with the 5 additional priority existing chemicals they'll be reviewing in the coming years. And then the columns reflect some of the decision criteria they used. I'll just say if I was EPA, I'd be looking at what is not covered as a HAP, where we don't have coverage under environmental statutes like RCRA and CERCLA or the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and said EPA has really kind of looked at that as a valuable source of materials. So you'll see some of the things that they prioritize. Having an IRIS value, for example, is something they thought was important to prioritizing these chemicals. And then you'll see at the bottom there the list of the 10 others that they didn't add as priority chemicals at this stage, but are likely to in the future. This is just a chart that we've used a little bit internally because I think there's obviously a little bit of confusion. I know you all are very familiar with what's on the right-hand side, which is Clean Air Act air toxic standards, looking at outdoor air for things like chemical and wood products facilities covered by different source categories. In the middle is really the program that is driving a lot in both the Clean Air Act and TSCA, which is the IRIS program. It's never been authorized by Congress, operated out of the research office at EPA. Frankly, just about anyone who's ever looked at IRIS assessments has raised significant concerns about the values they've generated for both cancer and non-cancer effects. That is the leading source of scientific information for the TSCA program as well, which on the left-hand side here you can see is really what's driving worker and consumer exposure-based bans or extremely low occupational exposure limits. So they're all interrelated, and at least for formaldehyde, there's one other concentric circle here, which is FIFRA. And that is true of several of the other chemicals being reviewed by TSCA, that they also are covered by as pesticides or with pesticidal uses under FIFRA. So quite a bit happening all in one, and different levels of threats, at least for us as a company, our customers, and ones that are very concerning, that this IRIS program that has been heavily criticized by the scientific community and out of step with the international determinations on things like formaldehyde is a driver of both TSCA and Clean Air Act priorities. To give you a sense, formaldehyde, we're right smack dab in the middle of the risk evaluation process. So earlier this year, EPA in mid-March released a draft risk evaluation of formaldehyde. I'll talk a little bit about what was in there, with a 60-day comment period and a simultaneous peer review process by a body that was created under the 2016 amendments to TSCA called the Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals. Serves a similar function to the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee for the Air Office at EPA. So really a truncated process. A lot of comments they received, and now EPA is actually as a proposed consent decree to establish for itself a deadline of needing to issue a final risk evaluation that may determine that formaldehyde constitutes an unreasonable risk across a number of uses by December of this year. While that's not a regulation, it triggers that future risk management that is very concerning to us, a 2-year clock for that. And then ultimately, as Caffey talked about for some of those solvents, a process where as soon as the next couple of years after a final risk management regulation comes out, potential bans or workplace standards, mandatory deadlines across the 5 years that follow. So a lot happening in the near future. This is all based upon an IRIS assessment that was issued in draft form in early 2022. Has not yet been finalized and has been criticized by quite a few scientific bodies that have looked at it. It did go through a review process by the National Academy of Sciences. Happy to talk more about that, but there's a lot that is built in here. And all this is happening while EPA is also reviewing formaldehyde under FIFRA, and obviously a pretty speedy election year timeline for formaldehyde. So just to maybe share a little bit about formaldehyde, it's really a building block chemistry. It's used, as you can see here, with quite a few other chemistries to make important intermediates, but also end-use products across agriculture and building and construction and a wide variety of other things. In addition, there's several of the other building block chemistries that are used with formaldehyde that are also under regulatory threats. And I think the other distinguishing factor is formaldehyde is contained in any of the supposed alternatives to formaldehyde for most major uses, and things like formaldehyde-based resins for polyurethanes in the form of isocyanate-based resins. Still relies upon formaldehyde as a building block. So as EPA looks at potential bans on manufacture or import of formaldehyde, you really could limit the availability of those end-use products and ultimately impact your clients in a variety of ways that they may not be aware of. We work very closely with firms like Squire, Pattons, Boggs, but also the American Chemistry Council and other trade groups. We've got quite a few resources on all the ways in which formaldehyde is used in medical and housing, national security, automotive applications, and happy to share more information here. But we've got quite a few pictures that are worth 1,000 words to help describe those supply chains and the ways in which formaldehyde is critical. Wanted to share a few key takeaways from EPA's draft risk evaluation. So as mentioned previously, TSCA requires EPA to evaluate whether a chemical substance presents an unreasonable risk without looking at costs or other non-risk factors. In that March risk evaluation, EPA preliminarily found that formaldehyde presents an unreasonable risk of injury to human health across pretty much every type of use. And I'll show a quick chart in a second here that helps to illustrate that. And as I mentioned before, that then triggers EPA to finalize those risk determinations and within 2 years to issue risk management rules. So here's EPA's life cycle of formaldehyde, which includes upstream manufacture and import processing for pretty much everything you can think of, a wide variety of industrial, commercial, and consumer uses, as well as recycling, disposal, and other uses. So just to give you a sense, EPA determined that all manufacturing and import, all processing as a reactant, processing incorporation into formulation, incorporating into articles, repackaging, recycling, all industrial uses, all but one commercial use, and all but 3 consumer uses are unreasonable risks that could be subject to bans or unachievable workplace or consumer standards. So, just to give you a sense, this goes down to the level of buying lawn and garden products at a retail store is potentially subject to a ban under EPA's approach here. It includes quite a few end-use sectors that could affect a number of your small entities in your state. Here's a few of the other, to the right, you'll see a quick map of how EPA structured this risk evaluation. To the left, you'll see a few quotes where EPA did determine that there's not likely to be an impact to the environment in terms of land and water, although potentially impact in terms of air. They had a few important caveats and frankly try to, I think, disavow some things they don't want to regulate under TSCA. The primary sources, for example, of outdoor formaldehyde in the U.S. are biogenic sources like vegetation and soil, as well as wildfires. Tens of thousands of times more formaldehyde is emitted from those sources than from the chemical industry, for example. EPA also included what Caffey referred to as an ECHL, and EPA has now started calling an occupational exposure value, or OEV, which is similar to that OSHA PEL, in this case of 11 parts per billion, which is extremely low. And then some corresponding values for 15 minutes, as well as a lifetime value for cancer that is also very low and potentially below background levels. So I'll give you a slight sense of scale here. You saw this chart already from Caffey, but this follows the trend of what we've seen with the solvents of extremely low and often below background levels or below detectable limits, exposure limits for these chemicals under review under TSCA. So here's a little bit about kind of the reality check for that potential ECHL, just to give you a sense. That's 70 times below OSHA's levels, 30 times below recently updated European Union occupational limits. So these were updated 4 years ago, and they settled on a value of 300 parts per billion. That's just above the level of formaldehyde in exhaled human breath, which averages between 4 and 7 parts per billion. It's below the detection limit for OSHA-approved analytical methods. It's well below, and EPA acknowledges this in the risk evaluation, well below the
share?
measured in. Sorry about that. Is there a question?
Okay, hold on just a quick second.
And it's well below the levels in ambient air and below levels seen in typical U.S. residences, offices that have nothing to do with formaldehyde production or use, classrooms. And so really extremely low starting point for a potential regulatory value. So just wanted to cover a couple of things real quick and then make sure we have plenty of time for questions. Here's a little bit more. This is all from EPA data from the risk evaluation. You see there in purple, the draft occupational limit, and then in blue are some of the ranges from EPA reviewed studies of what the levels of formaldehyde are in homes, classrooms, commercial buildings, government offices, et cetera. So quite a bit above that level the EPA is using as a starting point. And then you'll see compared on the right there to the EU and OSHA levels. Quite a few folks weighed in on this draft risk evaluation. We had a pretty diverse set of trade associations and state groups and a lot of folks that you may be interested in working with or talking to. It included a group of 20 state attorneys general led by Brenna Bird of Iowa. It included comments from the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, some particular state groups like the California Department of Food and Agriculture that raised concerns with the potential impacts on formaldehyde's use for aquaculture, the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. Several members of Congress weighed in with concerns with both EPA's conclusions and process, the American Farm Bureau, the Veterinary Medical Association, a number of wood product and retail groups, aerospace, automotive. So a pretty good cross-section, all of whom had major concerns, frankly, very little support for EPA's approach. Unfortunately, we heard some troubling signs that EPA is going to rush through this process and may not meaningfully engage those public comments. However, I do think, and this is one that allows us as a company and our customers to sleep at night a little bit, there's quite a few favorable regulatory dynamics. And Caffey flagged a lot of the key legal issues. In addition, there's some really major questions about how EPA is going to implement some of the standards they're looking at here in terms of very practical issues, the degree to which some of these chemicals like formaldehyde are ubiquitous, high background levels. EPA is potentially very inconsistent with a number of other federal agency standards as well as international standards. They're looking at potentially difficult to regulate workplaces. There's a lot to still be worked out in terms of implementation between EPA and OSHA. In the middle there, you'll see some mitigating circumstances, including regulatory threats to formaldehyde alternatives, potential exemptions under TSCA for de minimis levels that EPA has used in other settings like the Toxics Release Inventory and the Clean Air Act, Plywood MAC rule in particular. Potential exemptions for wood product standards regulated by the California Air Resources Board and TSCA, and a few other things that enable, I think, us to make a really strong argument that unreasonable risks are fully addressed, including our strong industrial hygiene programs and community relations. And on the right, there's a lot of other shoes to drop, including we've now had what looks to be 2 and maybe 3 very adverse peer reviews where EPA's fundamental conclusions about formaldehyde are heavily criticized by the scientific community. There's been strong legislative interest. There's actually bills that have been introduced in both the House and Senate to address this under the Farm Bill, through the appropriations process, a few other things. As Caffey mentioned, lots of litigation. Obviously, elections are very important here. Congressional oversight, we've had about a dozen letters sent by a bipartisan group of members of Congress over the last year and a half. And quite a bit of pushback from other federal agencies. And that's maybe one last thing to just end on here is I think there's some really important action items for you all. One is just to engage small businesses in your states. And they're probably already asking you questions, but if they're not, you're going to get questions about indirect effects of these toxic actions. The second is EPA is really not following a lot of the requirements under TSCA for interagency, intergovernmental, even intra-agency consultation and coordination. That was one of the comments we've heard from all the peer reviewers on formaldehyde is it appears that EPA's chemicals office hasn't even talked to EPA's air office about these issues or understood their regulatory programs. The third big bullet there is to advocate for small businesses to have a seat at the table. EPA's rejected requests to convene small business advocacy review panels during the risk evaluation stage when a lot of the big decisions are made. And then finally, I think there's an opportunity to engage your partners at the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards to help make sure that they understand the ways in which the TSCA program potentially threatens a lot of the good work that's been done in collaboration and cooperative federalism with your programs. So a few of those items are mentioned there, but there's a real risk that the TSCA program is viewed not as a gap-filling statute, but instead one that supersedes a lot of the Clean Air Act progress that's been made. And there's a few other slides that I'll share with you all just with some of the key provisions of TSCA, but I'll go ahead and pause there and see if there's any questions, realizing that we're running short on time.
So, any questions? I don't see anything posted in the chat.
Clint, this is Tony. While we're waiting on other people, do you think that a modification of Chevron deference or could this come to the level of major questions doctrine as well? You think there anything can happen, or Caffey too?
Caffey may have more insight there. I will say, I mean, I often, laugh a little bit because I think there's potentially an enormous impact from that. I do think there's also some provisions of TSCA that are clearly being violated, and some related to unreasonable risk and best available science and other things that Congress really beefed up in 2016. I think Chevron would a good helpful decision from the Supreme Court would hopefully drive things. Having said that, we're kind of off the map for major questions, right? I mean, what's really dictating outcomes here is extremely precautionary and unscientific iris values that are from a program that Congress has never authorized, right? This isn't like finding the elephant in the mouse hole, I think is what Congress has said around regulating greenhouse gases, for example, under the Clean Air Act. This is a program created out of thin air that is dictating key regulatory outcomes under the Clean Air Act and TSCA. So I'm hopeful that there's a legal solution, but also I think it's one where Congress needs to step up, and frankly EPA needs to step up and say, hey, Congress doesn't really update our environmental statutes that often, and they took the time to do so in 2016. They surely did not intend this, which is ban first approach based upon an unscientific, unauthorized program. But Caffey, I may see if you have any other insights there. Sorry for talking too long.
Well, I agree with what you said about both the importance of overturning Chevron deference if that happens, and the possible application of the major questions doctrine. But I think the most important precedent here is the 1980 decision of the Supreme Court in benzene. And any of you that are lawyers are interested in this, I would just advise you to go read that decision, because what the TSCA uses terminology that's fairly similar to the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And what it's doing here obviously is very similar to what OSHA was doing in 1980 when it regulated a toxic chemical, benzene, under that act, and it went beyond what was reasonably necessary. And those are the words used in that act and the words used in TSCA. So I think there's a lot of parallels, and I would not at all be surprised if one or more of these cases that we're bringing, I suspect, will make its way to the Supreme Court. And when that happens, I think you might see a lot of reference to and reliance upon the benzene decision.
Great. Any other questions? And if not, I'll just say thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate all the work that you all do. And if there's anything that you think of as it relates to these TSCA issues, the intersection with your work, where we can be helpful, I want to volunteer at Caffey, but we'd love to help get you connected with more resources as we move forward here.
And we thank you, both Caffey and Clint, for your willingness to share with our group, to open up and share your vast knowledge. We kind of rely a lot on that, and the time you had taken to prepare and deliver your presentation today. So thank you. Actually, you had such a good presentation. It was very, I'd have to kind of mull it over before I could even remotely come up with an intelligent question